Alright, so here we are. We're in this handy-dandy document camera, and the first example we're going to go through is what a frequency distribution is and how to make one. And in order to do this, I'm going to give you guys some example data that'll be a little bit simpler to work with than anything that's in the class survey. And then when we go back to the PowerPoints, I'll show you some examples that come from the class survey. So right now we're going to switch gears and we're going to use some made-up data about the number of times that 12 people have been arrested. And so for each of these numbers, this is going to be the number of times that each person in our sample has been arrested. So this person has been arrested 2 times, this person has been arrested 1 time, this person has not been arrested, this person has not been arrested, and so on. So I'm going to put 12 numbers here, and each of these 12 numbers is going to refer to a person and the number of times they've been arrested. Alright, so we should have 12 numbers here, and again, each of these is the number of times that each of these 12 people have been arrested. So 2 times, 1 time, 0 times, 0 times, and so on until this last person here in our sample has been arrested 4 times. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this data here and put it into a frequency distribution so that it'll be a little bit more organized. And as I said before, there are 2 steps to creating a frequency distribution. The first step is to list out the different values that your data has. So these are all of the observations in our data, and we're going to list out each of the different observations that we see. So that means for step 1 here, we're going to list out the different numbers of arrests that appear in our sample. So here in our sample, some people have been arrested 0 times. And when we have, when we have numerical data, we're going to list them in order. We're not going to arrest them in order. All right, so we have somebody with 0 arrests, and a couple of people with 0 arrests. We have a couple of people who have been arrested 1 time. So again, these are all different values that our variable can take on, where our variable is number of arrests of people in this 12-person sample. So some people have been arrested twice, some people have been arrested 3 times, and some people have been arrested 4 times. If you look at this list of numbers here, nobody has been arrested 5 times or 6 times or 7 times or any times more than 4. So in listing out the possible values that our data can take on in this sample, we're going to stop at 4. Because by listing 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, we've now covered all of the different values that our data can take on. The second step in creating a frequency distribution is going to be to list out the number of times each of these values appears in the data. And we're going to call that our frequency, or F. So we're going to make a second column here in creating a frequency distribution that shows us the number of times each of these different values appears in the data. So in other words, how many times do we see the number 0? So we can count them up. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. That means 0 appears 4 times. We're going to put a 4 for frequency. How many times do we see the number 1? We've got 1, 2, 3. That means the number 1 appears 3 times. And we're going to put a 3 for our frequency. And we'll do the same thing for each of these values. So here we've got the number 2 appearing 2 times, the number 3 appearing 1 time, and the number 4 appearing 2 times. And that's it. We've created a frequency distribution. And we can add one more thing to it, which will be the total. And so if you add all of these up, you get the number 12. And here 12 means that in all we have 12 observations in our sample. So 12 people who have each been arrested some number of times, that means we have 12 observations total. And the way you read this frequency distribution then is that you can now see at a glance, in our sample of 12 people, there are 4 people who were not arrested at all. There were 2 people who were arrested 4 times. There was 1 person who was arrested 3 times, and so on. So it takes what's sort of a jumble of numbers at a glance and organizes it so that you can take a look at it and quickly see the number of people who had each number of arrests. So this is one example of a frequency distribution. And you'll notice here that this is a ratio level variable. So we can put number of arrests in order from least to most. 0 arrests is less than 1 arrest, and so on. And we have a true 0 point where 0 arrests refers to no arrests. But you can also create frequency distributions for other types of variables. So I'm going to give you an example that has an ordinal level variable. So we're going to say that we now have a sample of 8 people, so we're moving on. This is going to be another example. So I'll draw a line just to demonstrate that. So we have another set of data here, which is going to be the type of sentence that 8 people got after they were sentenced. And so our type of sentence is going to be a variable. And the sentences that these 8 people got were prison, jail, prison, probation, a fine, jail, a fine, and probation. So again, similar to what I had up here, this is raw data, so we're just looking at the type of sentences that 8 people got. So this right here refers to one person getting prison as a sentence, one person getting jail as a sentence, another person getting prison as a sentence, a different person getting probation as a sentence, and so on. And what we want to do is we want to take this raw data and organize it by putting it in a frequency distribution. So we're going to follow the same 2 steps here. Our first step is going to be to list out the different values or different types of observations that we see in our sample. So for our first step, we're going to say we've got type of sentence, and we're going to list out the different types of sentences that we see here. And as we did in the first one, we're going to put them in order. So here we have an ordinal level variable. We have some sentences that are more severe and sometimes sentences that are less severe, but they're not numerical, so it's ordinal. So we're going to put them in order from sort of the least severe sentence to the most severe sentence. And here, most people would agree that a fine is the least severe sentence, followed by probation, followed by jail, followed by prison as your most severe type of sentence. So we're going to list them in that order. We got fine, we got probation, we got jail, and we got prison. So again, in this first step here, we've just listed out the different values that our data can take on in this sample of 8 people. Our next step is to list out the number of times that each of these different values appears in the sample. So if you count them up, you can see here's one person who got a fine and another person who got a fine. That's 2 fines. We have 2 instances of probation. We have 2 instances of jail, and finally we also have 2 instances of prison. And as a final thing you can do here, and this is also good to just double check that you've got all the right values in there, you can take the total here. If you add all these together, you get 8, and that should correspond to the number of observations you have total. So we have 8 people here who had different sentences, and we have a total of 8. Right, and as one final note here, we refer to a total in this case as n, where n is the total number of observations that you have in your sample. So we would say that n for our first example is 12, and n for our second example is 8. That's because we have 12 people who told us how many arrests they had here, and 8 people who told us what sentence we had here in this example. All right, so that's a frequency distribution, and now I'm going to hop back into the PowerPoint and show you some examples that came from the class data.